friends, welcome back. I'm Christina, the manager of the Pacific Beach Library. Thank you for joining me for day 6 of our read-along together of Roughing It by Mark Twain. Today we're going to read 4 chapters. It's going to be a long reading day, so as usual, I will try not to talk too much. We'll see how that goes. Today's tea that I'm enjoying is a Blue Lady Grey. So it just started steeping a little bit, so this first cup, I'm only going to do a little cup because it's not as strong as I think I would like. So midway through the read, I'll probably add on to it. It already has such a good smell, though. That's really nice. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what happened in yesterday's reading. I will start by saying I was a little uncomfortable with some of what I was reading yesterday. We'll talk a bit about it, but so basically, in the previous day, we had ended with, him describing his, what he is seeing in Salt Lake City and in the Utah territory. And specifically, he was talking a bit about the Mormons, and he was poking some fun at them in the last chapter, or the previous day's reading. In chapter 15, he was talking to a bit more about how he didn't get to really know Brigham Young very much, but he was saying that he spoke to somebody who had said that he had been to dinner at Brigham Young's house. And in the course of the story about talking what it was like when he visited Brigham Young, it's like it went from saying he had like 20 wives to 50 wives to maybe 100 wives, and so many wives he couldn't even keep track of how many he had and how many kids he had. And he started stretching out the stories about how, you know, like if you give one present to one wife, then each other wife is going to ask for the same present, and it has to be at least as nice or else they're going to be upset and jealous. Likewise, if you're a visitor and you give one little gift, like even a little whistle to one of the kids, all the kids are going to want the same whistle. So it's not only is it going to be expensive, but it's also going to be a situation where they're all whistling and it's going to drive you crazy from the sound. So you got to be really careful when you have a large family like that. And so, he tells this whole long story, and it's funny, about what it's like having a really large Mormon polygamous family. And Mark Twain sort of ends it with saying, that Brigham Young assures this Mr. Johnson, who told the tale to Mark Twain, according to Twain, that he says, "Take my word for it, 10 or 11 wives is all you need. Never go over it." So there you go, max out at 10 or 11 wives. He does end it, though, by saying, the chapter was saying, "Some instinct or other made me set this Johnson down as being unreliable." Perhaps there was a little bit of stretching even going on in the tale before it got to Mark Twain. But he says it was a pleasant story, especially in contrast to the reticent Mormons, to get this verbose, grandiose story. So he went ahead and related it to us, and it's a fun story. The next chapter, chapter 16, was basically him going on about the Mormon Bible. And I will say, as a reader, not as much fun as some of the other chapters. It was like he went on and just gave these long descriptions or long excerpts from the Mormon Testament, followed by a little bit of poking fun at it. And in fact, it was a little bit amusing too. And he did say, like, at one point, like, he has this really long passage, and he says, just then at the end of the passage, it says, "And the 100th part I have not written." And then Twain comes back with, "Well, it seems a pity that he didn't finish it because this dreary chapter was just about to become interesting." And so, but yeah, he does conclude that it was the Mormon Bible is rather stupid and tiresome to read, but nothing vicious in its teachings. Its code of morals is unobjectionable. But he also does say that it's basically a rehashing of the New Testament, the New Testament. So just a little aside, as a reader, I know he was making fun. I know he was being satiric, but at the same time, I don't know if this is just me being a little too sensitive, but I felt kind of weird about like poking fun at somebody's religious document. Like, I don't know. It didn't feel great to me doing it. But that said, we were reading a story and it was in its satire. So, let's see, continues. We next read a little bit about how much more expensive things are in the West. Like when things that used to cost a penny on the East Coast might cost 5 cents around Missouri or St. Louis. And then by the time they got out there, it was all the way up to like 25 cents. And so he was rather shocked and surprised to learn that, how the price of things changed. let's see. Finally, the last chapter we read was talking about their crossing of the desert and how excited he was to cross this desert. And then they passed much of it through the night, and it was amazing. And then they were getting ready to go the last little bit, and suddenly it became a lot less amazing. It became really hot, really painful, and this thing that had been novel, romantic, and dramatic became terrible. And so they make it through their last stretch of the desert there, and it's quite difficult for them. And then finally Twain concludes with a little excerpt about the modern Twain writing in and saying how, I just really want to squeeze in this phrase like about gilding the lily, gilding refined gold or painting the lily. And he's like, it didn't really fit there either, but I wanted to say it for so long I had to squeeze it in at some point, so there you go. So I thought that was actually a really fun way too of Twain sort of what is it called, like in acting when you break the fourth wall, I think it is, where you directly address the audience. And in that sense he was sort of like directly addressing the reader and saying like, here's this story, and I'm gonna just admit, as a writer I wanted to throw in this little thing, so I did, and it doesn't quite fit, but let's go with it, let's keep going. And so I thought that was a really friendly, engaging thing to do. All right, so now, yes, I kept it not too long because we do have a long bit of reading today. Today we're going to read chapters 19 through 22 of Roughing It by Mark Twain. Let's start with chapter 19. On the morning of the 16th day out from St. Joseph, we arrived at the entrance of Rocky Canyon, 250 miles from Salt Lake. It was along in this wild country somewhere, and far from any habitation of white men, except the stage stations, that we came across the wretchedest type of mankind I have ever seen up to this writing. I refer to the Goshute Indians. From what we could see and all we could learn, they are very considerably inferior to even the despised Digger Indians of California, inferior to all races of savages on our continent, inferior to even the Terra del Fuegans, inferior to the Hottentots, and actually inferior in some respects to the Kitchis of Africa. Indeed, I have been obliged to look the bulky volumes of Wood's Uncivilized Races of Men clear through in order to find a savage tribe degraded enough to take rank with the Goshutes. I find but one people fairly open to that shameful verdict. It is the Bosjesmans, Bushmen of South Africa. Such of the Goshutes as we saw along the road and hanging about the stations were small, lean, scrawny creatures, in complexion a dull black like the ordinary American Negro, their faces and hands bearing dirt which had been hoarding and accumulating for months, years, and even generations according to the age of the proprietor, a silent, sneaking, treacherous-looking race, taking note of everything covertly like all the other noble red men that we do not read about, and betraying no sign in their countenances. Indolent, everlastingly patient and tireless, like all other Indians. Prideless beggars, for if the beggar instinct were left out of an Indian, he would not go any more than a clock without a pendulum. Hungry, always hungry, and yet never refusing anything that a hog would eat, though often eating what a hog would decline. Hunters, by having no higher ambition than to kill and eat jackass rabbits, crickets, and grasshoppers, and embezzle carrion from the buzzards and coyotes. Savages who, when asked if they have the common Indian belief in a great spirit, show us something which almost amounts to emotion, thinking whiskey is referred to. A thin, scattering race of almost naked black children, these Goshutes are, who produce nothing at all and have no villages and no gatherings together into strictly defined tribal communities. A people whose only shelter is a rag cast on a bush to keep off a portion of the snow, and yet who inhabit one of the most rocky, wintry, repulsive wastes that our country or any other can exhibit. The Bushmen and our Goshutes are manifestly descended from the self-same gorilla or kangaroo or Norway rat, whichever animal atom the Darwinians trace them to. One would as soon expect the rabbits to fight to the Goshutes, and yet they used to live off the offal and refuse of the stations a few months, and then come some dark night when no mischief was expected, and burn down the buildings and kill the men from ambush as they rushed out. And once, in the night, they attacked the stagecoach when a district judge of Nevada Territory was the only passenger, and with their first volley of arrows, and a bullet or two, they riddled the stage curtains, wounded a horse or two, and mortally wounded the driver. The latter was full of pluck, and so was his passenger. At the driver's call At the driver's call, Judge Mott swung himself out, clambered to the box, and seized the reins of the team, and away they plunged through the racing mob of skeletons and under a hurtling storm of missiles. The stricken driver had sunk down on the boot as soon as he was wounded, but had held on to the reins and said he would manage to keep hold of them until relieved. And after they were taken from his relaxing grasp, he lay with his head between Judge Mott's feet and tranquilly gave directions about the road. He said he believed he could live till the miscreants were outrun and left behind, and that if he managed that, the main difficulty would be at an end, and then if the judge drove so and so, giving directions about bad places in the road and general course, he would reach the next station without trouble. The judge distanced the enemy and at last rattled up to the station and knew that the night's perils were done. But there was no comrade in arms for him to rejoice with, for the soldierly driver was dead. Let us forget that we have been saying harsh things about the overland drivers now. The disgust which the Goshutes gave me, a disciple of Cooper and a worshipper of the Red Man, even of the scholarly savages in the land of the Mohicans, who are fittingly associated with backwoodsmen who divide each sentence into two equal parts, one part critically grammatical, refined, and choice of language, and the other part just such an attempt to talk like a hunter or a mountaineer as a Broadway clerk might make after eating an edition of Emerson Bennett's works and studying frontier life at the Bowery Theater a couple of weeks. I say that the nausea which the Goshutes gave me, an Indian worshiper, set me to examining authorities to see if perchance I had been overestimating the Red Man while viewing him through the mellow moonshine of romance. The revelations that came were disenchanting. It was curious to see how quickly the paint and tinsel fell away from him and left him treacherous, filthy, and repulsive, and how quickly the evidences accumulated that wherever one finds an Indian tribe, he has only found Goshutes more or less modified by circumstances and surroundings. But Goshutes, after all. They deserve pity, poor creatures, and they can have mine. At this distance. Nearer by, they never get anybody's. There is an impression abroad that the Baltimore and Washington Railroad Company and many of its employees are Goshutes, but it is an error. There is only a plausible resemblance which, while it is apt enough to mislead the ignorant, cannot deceive parties who have contemplated both tribes. But seriously, it was not only poor wit, but very wrong to start the report referred to above, for however innocent the motive may have been, the necessary effect was to injure the reputation of a class who have a hard enough time of it in the pitiless deserts of the Rocky Mountains, heaven knows. If we cannot find it in our hearts to give those poor naked creatures our Christian sympathy and compassion, in God's name, let us at least not throw mud at them. Chapter 20. On the 17th day, we passed the highest mountain peaks we had yet seen, and although the day was very warm, the night that followed upon its heels was wintry cold, and blankets were next to useless. On the 18th day, we encountered the eastward-bound telegraph constructors at Reese River Station and sent a message to His Excellency Governor Nye at Carson City, distant 156 miles. On the 19th day, we crossed the Great American Desert, 40 memorable miles of bottomless sand, into which the coach wheels sunk from 6 inches to a foot. We worked our passage most of the way across. That is to say, we got out and walked. It was a dreary pull and a long and thirsty one, for we had no water. From one extremity of this desert to the other, the road was white with the bones of oxen and horses. It would hardly be an exaggeration to say that we could have walked the 40 miles and set our feet on a bone at every step. The desert was one prodigious graveyard, and the log chains, wagon tires, and rotting wrecks of vehicles were almost as thick as the bones. I think we saw log chains enough rusting there in the desert to reach across any state in the Union. Do not these relics suggest something of an idea of the fearful suffering and privation the early emigrants to California endured? At the border of the desert lies Carson City, or the Sink of the Carson, a shallow, melancholy sheet of water some 80 or 100 miles in circumference. Carson River empties into it and is lost, sinks mysteriously into the earth, and never appears in the light of the sun again, for the lake has no outlet whatever. There are several rivers in Nevada, and they all have this mysterious fate. They end in various lakes or sinks, and that is the last of them. Carson Lake, Humboldt Lake, Walker Lake, Mono Lake are all great sheets of water without any visible outlet. Water is always flowing into them. None is ever seen to flow out of them. And yet they remain always level full, neither receding nor overflowing. What they do with their surplus is only known to the Creator. On the western verge of the desert, we halted a moment at Ragtown. It consisted of one log house and is not set down on the map. This reminds me of a circumstance. Just after we left Julesburg on the Platte, I was sitting with the driver, and he said, "I can tell you a most laughable thing indeed, if you would like to listen to it. Horace Greeley went over this road once. When he was leaving Carson City, he told the driver, Hank Monk, that he had an engagement to lecture at Placerville and was very anxious to go through quick. Hank Monk cracked his whip and started off at an awful pace. The coach bounced up and down in such a terrific way that it jolted the buttons all off of Horace's coat, and finally shot his head clean through the roof of the stage, and then he yelled at Hank Monk and begged him to go easier. Said he weren't in as much of a hurry as he was a while ago. But Hank Monk said, 'Keep your seat, Horace, and I'll get you there on time.' And you bet he did too. What was left of him." A day or two after that, we picked up a Denver man at the crossroads, and he told us a good deal about the country and the Gregory diggings. He seemed a very entertaining person and a man well posted in the affairs of Colorado. By and by he remarked, "I can tell you a most laughable thing indeed, if you would like to listen to it. Horace Greeley went over this road once. When he was leaving Carson City, he told the driver, Hank Monk, that he had an engagement to lecture at Placerville and was very anxious to go through quick. Hank Monk cracked his whip and started off at an awful pace. The coach bounced up and down in such a terrific way that it jolted the buttons all off of Horace's coat, and finally shot his head clean through the roof of the stage, and then he yelled at Hank Monk and begged him to go easier, said he weren't in as much of a hurry as he was a while ago. But Hank Monk said, 'Keep your seat, Horace, and I'll get you there on time.' And you bet he did too. What was left of him?" At Fort Bridger, some days after this, we took on board a cavalry sergeant, a very proper and soldierly person indeed. From no other man during the whole journey did we gather such a store of concise and well-arranged military information. It was surprising to find in the desolate wilds of our country a man so thoroughly acquainted with everything useful to know in his line of life, and yet of such inferior rank and unpretentious bearing. For as much as 3 hours we listened to him with unabated interest. Finally, he got upon the subject of transcontinental travel, and presently said, "I can tell you a very laughable thing indeed, if you would like to listen to it. Horace Greeley went over this road once. When he was leaving Carson City, he told the driver, Hank Monk, that he had an engagement to lecture at Placerville and was very anxious to go through quick. Hank Monk cracked his whip and started off at an awful pace. The coach bounced up and down in such a terrific way that it jolted the buttons all off of Horace's coat, and finally shot his head clean through the roof of the stage, and then he yelled at Hank Monk and begged him to go easier, said he weren't in as much of a hurry as he was a while ago. But Hank Monk said, 'Keep your seat, Horace, and I'll get you there on time.' And you bet he did too. What was left of him." When we were 8 hours out from Salt Lake City, a Mormon preacher got in with us at a way station. A gentle, soft-spoken, kindly man, and one whom any stranger would warm to at first sight. I can never forget the pathos that was in his voice as he told, in simple language, the story of his people's wanderings and unpitied sufferings. No pulpit eloquence was ever so moving and so beautiful as this outcast picture of the first Mormon pilgrimage across the plains, struggling sorrowfully onward to the land of its banishment and marking its desolate way with graves and watering it with tears. His words so wrought upon us that it was a relief to us all when the conversation drifted into a more cheerful channel, and the natural features of the curious country we were in came under treatment. One matter after another was pleasantly discussed, and at length the stranger said, "I can tell you a most laughable thing indeed, if you would like to listen to it. Horace Greeley went over this road once. When he was leaving Carson City, he told the driver, Hank Monk, that he had an engagement to lecture in Placerville and was very anxious to go through quick. Hank Monk cracked his whip and started off at an awful pace. The coach bounced up and down in such a terrific way that it jolted the buttons all off of Horace's coat and finally shot his head clean through the roof of the stage, and then he yelled at Hank Monk and begged him to go easier, said he weren't in as much of a hurry as he was a while ago. But Hank Monk said, 'Keep your seat, Horace, and I'll get you there on time.' And you bet he did too. What was left of him?" 10 miles out of Ragtown, we found a poor wanderer who had laid down to die. He had walked as long as he could, but his limbs had failed him at last. Hunger and fatigue had conquered him. It would have been inhuman to leave him there. We paid his fare to Carson and lifted him into the coach. It was some little time before he showed any very decided signs of life, but by dint of chafing him and pouring brandy between his lips, we finally brought him to a languid consciousness. Then we fed him a little, and by he seemed to comprehend the situation, and a grateful light softened his eye. We made his mail sack bed as comfortable as possible and constructed a pillow for him with our coats. He seemed very thankful. Then he looked up in our faces and said, in a feeble voice that had a tremble of honest emotion in it, "Gentlemen, I know not who you are, but you have saved my life. And although I can never be able to repay you for it, I feel that I can at least make 1 hour of your long journey lighter. I take it you are strangers to this great thoroughfare, but I am entirely familiar with it. In this connection, I can tell you a most laughable thing. Indeed, if you would like to listen to it, Horace Greeley," I said impressively, "Suffering stranger, proceed at your peril. You see in me the melancholy wreck of a once stalwart and magnificent manhood. What has brought me to this? That thing which you are about to tell. Gradually, but surely, that tiresome old anecdote has sapped my strength, undermined my constitution, withered my life. Pity my helplessness. Spare me only just this once, and tell me about young George Washington and his little hatchet for a change." We were saved, but not so the invalid. In trying to retain the anecdote in his system, he strained himself and died in our arms. I am aware now that I ought not to have asked of the sturdiest citizen of all that region what I asked of that mere shadow of a man, for after 7 years' residence on the Pacific coast, I know that no passenger or driver on the Overland ever corked that anecdote in when a stranger was by and survived. Within a period of 6 years, I crossed and recrossed the Sierras between Nevada and California 13 times by stage and listened to that deathless incident 481 or 82 times. I have the list somewhere. Drivers always told it, conductors told it, landlords told it, chance passengers told it, the very Chinamen and vagrant Indians recounted it. I have had the same driver tell it to me 2 or 3 times in the same afternoon. It has come to me in all the multitude of tongues that Babel bequeathed to earth and flavored with whiskey, brandy, beer, cologne, sozadent, tobacco, garlic, onions, grasshoppers, everything that has a fragrance to it through all the long list of things that are gorged or guzzled by the sons of men. I never have smelt any anecdote as often as I have smelt that one. Never have smelt any anecdote that smelt so variegated as that one. And you never could learn to know it by its smell, because every time you thought you would learn the smell of it, it would turn up with a different smell. Bayard Taylor has written about this hoary anecdote. Richardson has published it. So have Jones, Smith, Johnson, Ross Brown, and every other correspondence indicting being that ever set his foot upon the great overland road anywhere between Julesburg and San Francisco, and I have heard that it is in the Talmud. I have seen it in print in 9 different foreign languages. I have been told that it is employed in the Inquisition in Rome, and I now learn with regret that it is going to be set to music. I do not think that such things are right. Stagecoaching on the overland is no more, and stage drivers are a race defunct. I wonder if they bequeathed that bald-headed anecdote to their successors, the railroad brakemen and conductors, and if these latter still persecute the helpless passenger with it until he concludes, as did many a tourist of other days, that the real grandeurs of the Pacific coast are not Yosemite and the big trees, but Hank Monk and his adventure with Horace Greeley. There's now a little starred asterisk in it. The note continues, "And what makes that worn anecdote the more aggravating is that the adventure it celebrates never occurred. If it were a good anecdote, that seeming demerit would be its chiefest virtue, for creative power belongs to greatness. But what ought to be done to a man who would wantonly contrive so flat a one as this? If I were to suggest what ought to be done to him, I should be called extravagant. But what does the 13th chapter of Daniel say? Aha! And now, chapter 21. We were approaching the end of our long journey. It was the morning of the 20th day. At noon, we would reach Carson City, the capital of Nevada Territory. We were not glad, but sorry. It had been a fine pleasure trip. We had fed fat on wonders every day. We were now well accustomed to stage life and very fond of it. So the idea of coming to a standstill and settling down to a humdrum existence in a village was not agreeable, but on the contrary, depressing. Visibly, our new home was a desert, walled in by barren, snow-clad mountains. There was not a tree in sight. There was no vegetation but the endless sagebrush and greasewood. All nature was gray with it. We were plowing through great deeps of powdery alkali dust that rose in thick clouds and floated across the plain like smoke from a burning house. We were coated with it like millers. So were the coach, the mules, the mailbags, the driver. We and the sagebrush and the other scenery were all one monotonous color. Long trains of freight wagons in the distance, enveloped in ascending masses of dust, suggested pictures of prairies on fire. These teams and their masters were the only life we saw. Otherwise, we moved in the midst of solitude, silence, and desolation. Every 20 steps, we passed the skeleton of some dead beast of burden, with its dust-coated skin stretched tightly over its empty ribs. Frequently, a solemn raven sat upon the skull or the hips and contemplated the passing coach with meditative serenity. By and by, Carson City was pointed out to us. It nestled in the edge of a great plain and was a sufficient number of miles away to look like an assemblage of mere white spots in the shadow of a grim range of mountains overlooking it, whose summits seemed lifted clear out of companionship and consciousness of earthly things. We arrived, disembarked, and the stage went on. It was a wooden town, its population 2,000 souls. The main street consisted of 4 or 5 blocks of little white frame stores which were too high to sit down on, but not too high for various other purposes. In fact, hardly high enough. They were packed close together, side by side, as if room were scarce in that mighty plain. The sidewalk was of boards that were more or less loose and inclined to rattle when walked upon. In the middle of the town, opposite the stores, was the plaza, which is native to all towns beyond the Rocky Mountains, a large, unfenced, level vacancy with a liberty pole in it, and very useful as a place for public auctions, horse trades, and mass meetings, and likewise for teamsters to camp in. 2 other sides of the plaza were faced by stores, offices, and stables. The rest of Carson City was pretty scattering. We were introduced to several citizens at the stage office and on the way up to the governor's from the hotel, among others to a Mr. Harris, who was on horseback. He began to say something, but interrupted himself with the remark, "I'll have to get you to excuse me a minute. Yonder is the witness that swore I helped to rob the California coach. A piece of impertinent intermeddling, sir, for I am not even acquainted with the man." Then he rode over and began to rebuke the stranger with a 6-shooter, and the stranger began to explain with another. When the pistols were emptied, the stranger resumed his work, mending a whiplash, and Mr. Harris rode by with a polite nod, homeward bound, with a bullet through one of his lungs and several in his hips, and from them issued little rivulets of blood that coursed down the horse's sides and made the animal look quite picturesque. I never saw Harris shoot a man after that, but it recalled to mind that first day in Carson. This was all we saw that day, for it was 2 o'clock now, and according to custom, the daily Washoe zephyr set in. A soaring dust drift about the size of the United States set up edgewise came with it, and the capital of Nevada Territory disappeared from view. Still, there were sights to be seen which were not wholly uninteresting to newcomers, for the vast dust cloud was thickly freckled with things strange to the upper air, things living and dead that flitted hither and thither, going and coming, appearing and disappearing among the rolling billows of dust. Hats, chickens, and parasols sailing in the remote heavens. Blankets, tin signs, sagebrush and shingles a shade lower. Doormats and buffalo robes lower still. Shovels and coal scuttles on the next grade. Glass doors, cats and little children on the next. Disrupted lumber yards, light buggies and wheelbarrows on the next. And down only 30 or 40 feet above ground was a scurrying storm of emigrating roofs and vacant lots. It was something to see that much. I could have seen more if I could have kept the dust out of my eyes. But seriously, a Washoe wind is by no means a trifling matter. It blows flimsy houses down, lifts shingle roofs occasionally, rolls up tin ones like sheet music, now and then blows a stagecoach over and spills the passengers, and tradition says the reason there are so many bald people there is that the wind blows the hair off their heads while they are looking skyward after their hats. Carson streets seldom look inactive on summer afternoons because there are so many citizens skipping around their escaping hats, like chambermaids trying to head off a spider. The Washoe Zephyr, Washoe is a pet nickname for Nevada, is a peculiarly scriptural wind, and that no man knoweth whence it cometh. That is to say, where it originates. It comes right over the mountains from the west, but when one crosses the ridge, he does not find any of it on the other side. It probably is manufactured on the mountaintop for the occasion and starts from there. It is a pretty regular wind in the summertime. Its office hours are from 2 in the afternoon till 2 the next morning, and anybody venturing abroad during those 12 hours needs to allow for the wind, or he will bring up a mile or two to leeward of the point he is aiming at. And yet, the first complaint a Washoe visitor to San Francisco makes is that the sea winds blow so there. There is a good deal of human nature in that. We found the state palace of the governor of Nevada Territory to consist of a white frame one-story house with 2 small rooms in it and a stanchion-supported shed in front, for grandeur. It compelled the respect of the citizen and inspired the Indians with awe. The newly arrived chief and associate justices of the territory and other machinery of the government were domiciled with less splendor. They were boarding around privately and had their offices in their bedrooms. The secretary and I took quarters in the ranch of a worthy French lady by the name of Bridget O'Flanagan, a camp follower of His Excellency the Governor. She had known him in his prosperity as Commander-in-Chief of the Metropolitan Police of New York, and she would not desert him in his adversity as Governor of Nevada. Our room was on the lower floor, facing the plaza, and when we had got our bed, a small table, 2 chairs, and the government fireproof safe, and the unabridged dictionary into it, there was still room enough left for a visitor. Maybe 2, but not without straining the walls. But the walls could stand it, at least the partitions could, for they consisted simply of one thickness of white cotton domestic, stretched from corner to corner of the room. This was the rule in Carson. Any other kind of partition was the rare exception. And if you stood in a dark room and your neighbors in the next had lights, the shadows on your canvas told queer secrets sometimes. Very often these partitions were made of old flour sacks basted together, and then the difference between the common herd and the aristocracy was that the common herd had unornamented sacks, while the walls of the aristocrat were overpowering with rudimental fresco, i.e., red and blue mill brands on the flour sacks. Occasionally also the better classes embellished their canvas by pasting pictures from Harper's Weekly on them. In many cases, too, the wealthy and the cultured rose to spittoons and other evidences of a sumptuous and luxurious taste. Here's a footnote for that. Washoe people take a joke so hard that I must explain that the above description was only the rule. There are many honorable exceptions in Carson, plastered ceilings and houses that had considerable furniture in them, empty. We had a carpet in a genuine Queensware wash bowl. Consequently, we were hated without reserve by the other tenants of the O'Flanagan Ranch. When we added a painted oilcloth window curtain, we simply took our lives into our own hands. To prevent bloodshed, I removed upstairs and took up quarters with the untitled plebeians in one of the 14 white pine cot bedsteads that stood in 2 long ranks in the one sole room of which the second story consisted. It was a jolly company, the 14. They were principally voluntary camp followers of the governor, who had joined his retinue by their election at New York and San Francisco and came along, feeling that in the scuffle for little territorial crumbs and offices, they could not make their condition more precarious than it was, and might reasonably expect to make it better. They were popularly known as the Irish Brigade, though there were only 4 or 5 Irishmen among all the governor's retainers. His good-natured excellency was much annoyed at the gossip his henchmen created, especially when there arose a rumor that they were paid assassins of his, brought along to quietly reduce the Democratic vote when desirable. Mrs. O'Flanagan was boarding and lodging them at $10 a week apiece, and they were cheerfully giving their notes for it. They were perfectly satisfied, but Bridget presently found that notes that could not be discounted were but a feeble constitution for a Carson boarding house. So she began to harry the governor to find employment for the brigade. Her importunities and theirs together drove him to a gentle desperation at last, and he finally summoned the brigade to his presence. Then said he, "Gentlemen, I have planned a lucrative and useful service for you, a service which will provide you with recreation amid noble landscapes and afford you never-ceasing opportunities for enriching your minds by observation and study. I want you to survey a railroad from Carson City westward to a certain point. When the legislature meets, I will have the necessary bill passed and the remuneration arranged." What? A railroad over the Sierra Nevada mountains? He converted them into surveyors, chain bearers, and so on, and turned them loose in the desert. It was recreation with a vengeance. Recreation on foot, lugging chains through sand and sagebrush, under a sultry sun, and among cattle bones, coyotes, and tarantulas. Romantic adventure could go no further. They surveyed very slowly, very deliberately, very carefully. They returned every night during the first week, dusty, footsore, tired, and hungry, but very jolly. They brought in great store of prodigious hairy spiders, tarantulas, and imprisoned them in covered tumblers upstairs in the ranch. After the first week, they had to camp on the field, for they were getting well eastward. They made a good many inquiries as to the location of that indefinite certain point, but got no information. At last, to a peculiarly urgent inquiry of, "How far eastward?" Governor Nye telegraphed back, "To the Atlantic Ocean, blast you, and then bridge it, and go on." This brought back the dusty toilers, who sent in a report and ceased from their labors. The governor was always comfortable about it. He said Mrs. Flanagan would hold him for the brigade's board anyhow, and he intended to get what entertainment he could out of the boys. He said, with his old-time pleasant twinkle, that he meant to survey them into Utah and then telegraph Brigham to hang them for trespass. The surveyors brought back more tarantulas with them, and so we had quite a menagerie arranged among the shelves of the room. Some of these spiders could straddle over a common saucer with their hairy muscular legs, and when their feelings were hurt or their dignity offended, they were the wickedest-looking desperadoes the animal world can furnish. If their glass prison houses were touched ever so lightly, they were up and spoiling for a fight in a minute. Starchy? Proud? Indeed, they would take up a straw and pick their teeth like a member of Congress. There was, as usual, a furious zephyr blowing the first night of the brigade's return, and about midnight the roof of an adjoining stable blew off, and a corner of it came crashing through the side of our ranch. There was a simultaneous awakening and a tumultuous muster of the brigade in the dark, and a general tumbling and sprawling over each other in the narrow aisle between the bedrows. In the midst of the turmoil, Bob H. sprung up out of a sound sleep and knocked down half a shelf with his head. Instantly he shouted, "Turn out, boys! The tarantulas is loose!" No warning ever sounded so dreadful. Nobody tried any longer to leave the room, lest he might step on a tarantula. Every man groped for a trunk or a bed and jumped on it. Then followed the strangest silence, a silence of grisly suspense it was too, waiting, expectancy, fear. It was as dark as pitch, and one had to imagine the spectacle of these 14 scant-clad men roosting gingerly on trunks and beds, for not a thing could be seen. Then came occasional little interruptions of the silence, and one could recognize a man and tell his locality by his voice, or locate any other sound a sufferer made by his gropings or changes of positions. The occasional voices were not given to much speaking. You simply heard a gentle ejaculation of "ow!" followed by a solid thump, and you knew the gentleman had felt a hairy blanket or something touch his bare skin and had skipped from a bed to the floor. Another silence. Presently you would hear a gasping voice say, "Something's crawling up the back of my neck." Every now and then you could hear a little subdued scramble and a sorrowful, "Oh, Lord." And then you knew that somebody was getting away with something he took for a tarantula, and not losing any time about it either. Directly, a voice in the corner rang out wild and clear, "I've got him! I've got him!" Pause, and probable change of circumstances. "No, he's got me! Oh, ain't they never going to fetch a lantern?" The lantern came at that moment, in the hands of Mrs. O'Flanagan, whose anxiety to know the amount of damage done by the assaulting roof had not prevented her waiting a judicious interval, after getting out of bed and lighting up, to see if the wind was done now upstairs, or had a larger contract. The landscape presented when the lantern flashed into the room was picturesque and might have been funny to some people, but was not to us. Although we were perched so strangely upon boxes, trunks, and beds, and so strangely attired, too, we were too earnestly distressed and too genuinely miserable to see any fun about it, and there was not the semblance of a smile visible. I know I am not capable of suffering more than I did during those few minutes of suspense in the dark, surrounded by those creeping, bloody-minded tarantulas. I had skipped from bed to bed and from box to box in a cold agony, and every time I touched anything that was fuzzy, I fancied I felt the fangs. I had rather go to war than live that episode over again. Nobody was hurt. The man who thought a tarantula had got him was mistaken. Only a crack in a box had caught his finger. Not one of those escaped tarantulas was ever seen again. There were 10 or 12 of them. We took candles and hunted the place high and low for them, but with no success. Did we go back to bed then? We did nothing of the kind. Money could not have persuaded us to do it. We sat up the rest of the night playing cribbage and keeping a sharp lookout for the enemy. And now, chapter 22. As I'm pouring, I will point out too, I misread one of the words. The tarantula is described not as fuzzy, but as furzy. I thought that was kind of cute. F-U-R-Z-Y. Okay, chapter 22. It was the end of August, and the skies were cloudless and the weather superb. In 2 or 3 weeks, I had grown wonderfully fascinated with the curious new country and concluded to put off my return to the States a while. I had grown well accustomed to wearing a damaged slouch hat, blue woolen shirt, and pants crammed into boot tops, and gloried in the absence of coat, vest, and braces. I felt rowdyish and bully, as the historian Josephus phrases it in his fine chapter upon the destruction of the temple. It seemed to me that nothing could be so fine and so romantic. I had become an officer of the government, but that was for mere sublimity. The office was a unique sinecure. I had nothing to do and no salary. I was private secretary to His Majesty the Secretary, and there was not yet writing enough for 2 of us. So Johnny K. and I devoted our time to amusement. He was the young son of an Ohio nabob and was out there for recreation. He got it. He had heard a world of talk about the marvelous beauty of Lake Tahoe, and finally curiosity drove us thither to see it. 3 or 4 members of the brigade had been there and located some timberlands on its shores and stored up a quantity of provisions in their camp. We strapped a couple of blankets on our shoulders and took an axe apiece and started, for we intended to take up a wood ranch or sow ourselves and become wealthy. We were on foot. The reader will find it advantageous to go horseback. We were told that the distance was 11 miles. We tramped a long time on level ground, and then toiled laboriously up a mountain about 1,000 miles high and looked over. No lake there. We descended on the other side, crossed the valley, and toiled up another mountain 3,000 or 4,000 miles high, apparently, and looked over again. No lake yet. We sat down tired and perspiring and hired a couple of Chinamen to curse those people who had beguiled us. Thus refreshed, we presently resumed the march with renewed vigor and determination. We plodded on 2 or 3 hours longer, and at last the lake burst upon us, a noble sheet of blue water lifted 6,300 feet above the level of the sea, and walled in by a rim of snow-clad mountain peaks that towered aloft full 3,000 feet higher still. It was a vast oval, and one would have to use up 80 or 100 good miles in traveling around it. As it lay there with the shadows of the mountains brilliantly photographed upon its still surface, I thought it must surely be the fairest picture the whole earth affords. We found the small skiff belonging to the brigade boys, and without loss of time, set out across a deep bend of the lake toward the landmarks that signified the locality of the camp. I got Johnny to row, not because I mind exertion myself, but because it makes me sick to ride backwards when I am at work. But I steered. A 3-mile pull brought us to the camp just as the night fell, and we stepped ashore very tired and wolfishly hungry. In a cache among the rocks, we found the provisions and the cooking utensils, and then, all fatigued as I was, I sat down on a boulder and superintended while Johnny gathered wood and cooked supper. Many a man who had gone through what I had would have wanted to rest. It was a delicious supper. Hot bread, fried bacon, and black coffee. It was a delicious solitude we were in, too. 3 miles away was a sawmill and some workmen, but there were not 15 other human beings throughout the wide circumference of the lake. As the darkness closed down and the stars came out and spangled the great mirror with jewels, we smoked meditatively in the solemn hush and forgot our troubles and our pains. In due time, we spread our blankets in the warm sand between 2 large boulders and soon fell asleep, careless of the procession of ants that passed and threw rents in our clothing and explored our persons. Nothing could disturb the sleep that fettered us, for it had been fairly earned, and if our consciences had any sins on them, they had to adjourn court for that night anyway. The wind rose just as we were losing consciousness, and we were lulled to sleep by the beating of the surf upon the shore. It is always very cold on that lake shore in the night, but we had plenty of blankets and were warm enough. We never moved a muscle all night, but waked at early dawn in the original positions, and got up at once, thoroughly refreshed, free from soreness, and brimful of friskiness. There was no end of wholesome medicine in such an experience. That morning, we could have whipped 10 such people as we were the day before. Sick ones, at any rate. But the world is slow, and people will go to water cures and movement cures and to foreign lands for health. 3 months of camp life on Lake Tahoe would restore an Egyptian mummy to his pristine vigor and give him an appetite like an alligator. I do not mean the oldest and driest mummies, of course, but the fresher ones. The air up there in the clouds is very pure and fine, bracing and delicious. And why shouldn't it be? It is the same the angels breathe. I think that hardly any amount of fatigue can be gathered together that a man cannot sleep off in one night on the sand by its side. Not under a roof, but under the sky. It seldom or never rains there in the summertime. I know a man who went there to die, but he made a failure of it. He was a skeleton when he came and could barely stand. He had no appetite and did nothing but read tracts or reflect on the future. 3 months later, he was sleeping out of doors regularly, eating all he could hold, 3 times a day, and chasing game over mountains 3,000 feet high for recreation. And he was a skeleton no longer, but weighed part of a ton. This is no fancy sketch, but the truth. His disease was consumption. I confidently recommend his experience to other skeletons. I superintended again, and as soon as we had eaten breakfast, we got in the boat and skirted along the lake shore about 3 miles and disembarked. We liked the appearance of the place, and so we claimed some 300 acres of it and stuck our notices on a tree. It was yellow pine timberland, a dense forest of trees 100 feet high and from 1 to 5 feet through at the butt. It was necessary to fence our property, or we could not hold it. That is to say, it was necessary to cut down trees here and there and make them fall in such a way as to form a sort of enclosure, with pretty wide gaps in it. We cut down 3 trees apiece and found it such heartbreaking work that we decided to rest our case on those. If they held the property, well and good. If they didn't, let the property spill out through the gaps and go. It was no use to work ourselves to death merely to save a few acres of land. Next day, we came back to build a house, for a house was also necessary in order to hold the property. We decided to build a substantial log house and excite the envy of the brigade boys. But by the time we had cut and trimmed the first log, it seemed unnecessary to be so elaborate, and so we concluded to build it of saplings. However, 2 saplings, duly cut and trimmed, compelled recognition of the fact that a still modester architecture would satisfy the law, and so we concluded to build a brush house. We devoted the next day to this work, but we did so much sitting around and discussing that by the middle of the afternoon, we had achieved only a halfway sort of affair which one of us had to watch while the other cut brush, lest if both turned our backs, we might not be able to find it again. It had such a strong family resemblance to the surrounding vegetation. But we were satisfied with it. We were landowners now, duly seized and possessed and within the protection of the law. Therefore, we decided to take up our residence on our own domain and enjoy that large sense of independence which only such an experience can bring. Late the next afternoon, after a good long rest, we sailed away from the brigade camp with all the provisions and cooking utensils we could carry off. Borrow is the more accurate word. And just as the night was falling, we beached the boat at our own landing. That's going to conclude today's reading, and I was just going to show you a little picture of the house that they built, the little brush house as he puts it. There you go. So I have seen better houses constructed on Naked and Afraid, But we can talk about that a bit more tomorrow. So thank you again for joining me today for our reading. I'll see you tomorrow, I hope. And I hope you have a great rest of your week. Bye.